Okay, I think we're ready to start. Well, it's a little late now to get up, but everybody should put their name in the raffle so that we're going to raffle off Tom's book. It's free. Okay, I'm going to have Linda tell us a little bit about the virtual country store we're running.
Hi, everybody. Our 62nd annual country store for members only. If anybody would like to participate, you know, it's your typical ham and bean dinner, wreath. This year we're offering poinsettias. We're having the traditional cheese and roping. And if anybody would like to, that's a member, and if you're not and you really want to do this, you could be a member. Sign up tonight. The forms are at my at the table over there. And if you decide afterwards, we've sent out. You must have gotten the postcard that have the information on it, where you can call or text or email or whatever you want to get in touch with us and order. That's it. Oh, wait a minute. Let me just tell you. So it's Saturday, December 2nd. So that's we will either deliver or you can pick up. You can pick up at our house or we will deliver it. And but we need the orders in by Sunday, November 26th. So that should be okay.
All right, thanks. First, I want to say hi to everybody who joined us. What's up? Question. Oh, we got a question.
Ron, no.
What? Go ahead.
We have a representative from the Friends of the Library here tonight, Gina Tecci. She's seated down there. I think she has something that she wanted to just say.
Sure, if we get an announcement.
Hi, I'm Gina Tecci. I'm with the Friends of the Lynnfield Library. I'm Gina Tecci. Okay, that's better. I was helping out with the book sale for the Friends of the Lynnfield Library, and we just wanted to thank you guys for your $425 donation made from the sales from your bake sale. I think that's the most we've gotten from your bake sale, so bravo. And very much appreciated, and we had our meeting last night, and we were all very appreciative, so thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to our bake sale committee. All we did was raise the prices. That's why I went up.
We did the book sale. We raised the book sale prices too.
So, I want to thank everybody who joined us on our hike. We had a wonderful hike to Callenberg Quarry, Skull Cliff, and it just turned out to be a beautiful day. If you remember when I was here last time, it was coming up that Saturday, and I said, it's not going to happen Saturday. That rainy Saturday was going to come. So we scheduled it for a week after. And the hiking gods smiled on us, and we had like a 70-degree day, just a beautiful day. And we dragged some older citizens up and over that cliff twice. They went up, and nobody complained. Nobody had a problem. It just worked out so well. I'm just so happy about it. Okay, we have an email sign up here, and we'd like to get your email if you don't mind being on our email list. And we'd like you to like us and follow us on Facebook. And we'd like you to stay for some free refreshments afterwards. Okay, so let me introduce our guest speaker tonight. It's longtime Lynnfield resident Tom Dalton. He's a former member of the Lynn Historical Society, member of the board on the Lynn Historical Society. He's a retired journalist for the Daily Item and the Salem News. And in 2018, in anticipation of the 200th anniversary of Frederick Douglass's birth, Tom published Frederick Douglass, The Lynn Years, 1841 to 1848. Mr. Dalton realized how little was known about the great man's life during that formative period. He was able to uncover many important aspects of Douglass's life in those early years in Lynn. I've read the book and found it to be wonderful, easily readable narrative filled with interesting stories and local references. What I found most striking was how very young Douglass was at this time, when he wrote his first autobiography, narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. Tom's book has only whetted my appetite to learn more about the great orator. Please welcome local author Tom Dalton.
Thanks, Ron. I think you covered my entire talk. So. I want to thank the Lynnfield Historical Society for inviting me. I am a reluctant speaker. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Yes.
That's unfortunate. I actually got a call several months ago from Helen Breen. And I think if anybody else had called, I would have said no, but she's so nice. I know all the work she has done and all the stories she's done on Lynnfield. She's really, I consider her the town historian, so I felt obligated to come. I also know she hangs out with a very tough Irish crowd, the McKennas and the Owens. I was afraid they'd turn on me, so I decided I had to come. The Lynn Years of Frederick Douglass are a tough subject. Can I make this any taller? Is it?
Yeah, I can do that.
Lauren, do you think you can have a little light?
I just lifted it.
You want some light? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'll put the lights
Okay.
are fine.
Okay.
I just lifted it up. That was fine. I just tilted it.
Oh, okay, you okay? All right, good.
Yeah. I shouldn't have worn lips. It's really. I feel like I'm standing next to someone. When you read biographies of Douglass, and I've read most of them, they get to Lynn and they don't know what to do. They kind of go through it quickly, and it's proven for everyone to be a very tough period of his life to write about and to research. We know a tremendous amount about his years as a slave. He was a slave for 20 years in the eastern shore of Maryland and Baltimore. He escaped at the age of 20 and he goes to New Bedford, and he lives there for 3 years. And he went to New Bedford because he'd actually learned a trade in Baltimore. He worked in shipyards and he became a ship's caulker, so he had a skill. They said, go to New Bedford, you can get a job, because it was the whaling capital of the world and there are lots of ships, but they did not want to hire a black man, so he worked as a laborer the whole time he was there. And he also got involved with an Black Abolition Society, and he became a lay preacher at a church. But someone heard him speak there, and then he goes to Nantucket and speaks to the meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He's discovered there, and then he comes to Lynn. So we know a lot about New Bedford. When he leaves Lynn, he goes to Rochester, New York. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just a wonderful place.
My wife's here to tell me to stand up straight and speak loudly. So, fortunately, I can't find her in the crowd, so I'll pay no attention to her. So, in Rochester, New York, he lived there 25 years, and he started his own newspaper there, the North Star. Douglass really became the voice of the country's 3 million enslaved persons. He became very, very prominent there. A lot is known about his years in Rochester. He goes from Rochester to Washington, D.C., where he becomes a friend of presidents, a campaigner for the Republican Party, and a public official and wealthy. And so much is known about that period of his life. But Lynn is kind of a black hole in Douglass scholarship, and there are several reasons, but the primary reason is he really was barely in Lynn. He was there 6 years, but because he'd been hired as an agent or traveling speaker for the State Anti-Slavery Society, he was on the road all the time traveling. He went by train and boat and horseback and on foot sometimes, and it was a very tough life, particularly for a black man who faced segregation everywhere he traveled. He had to ride in the top of a carriage, horse-drawn carriage, up in the weather because they wouldn't allow him inside, and on the deck of a steamboat, not below deck if it was bad weather. And he would show up places and he would get, they'd yell nigger, nigger at him and throw things, and he got attacked by a mob one time. But he was, when I wrote this little book, which I tried to do, I think I'd been on the board of the Lynn Historical Society, and I knew we didn't know much about Douglass, so I said, I'm going to try to do something just on primary sources. So I'm just going to try to use letters, and I'll use journals, and I'll use 19th century newspapers. And but I couldn't keep it day by day. I had little index cards. I had a huge box of them. I tried to follow his life every day that I could, and I decided to sit down. I added up how many days he was in Lynn and how many days he was away, and it came up to almost 2/3 of the time he was away. So 4 of those 6 years he's not in Lynn. So Lynn is an address as much as it is a home for him. But in spite of that, Lynn is still an important period in his life, and important things happen to him there. I've been working with the state. There's a small Frederick Douglass Park in Lynn. We've been working with them to put up this interpretive sign. And one of the messages we have in that is that Lynn was a transformative period of his life. He came there a laborer, someone who was digging holes and hauling things and working in some manufacturing plants. But in Lynn, he starts his career as an abolitionist. That happened there. He becomes known as a writer and orator. So he arrives there a laborer. He ends up this pretty prominent abolitionist during his 6 years in Lynn. He also arrived in Lynn, and he was a fugitive slave. He's a runaway. At the age of 20, he jumped on a train in Baltimore and ran away. And so he arrives a fugitive. When he leaves Lynn 6 years later, he's a free man. Now, that happened because part of the time he was touring and speaking, he's in Great Britain, and 2 Quaker women saw how depressed he was. He was afraid to go home for fear if he returned to the United States he'd be caught. He was sad to be away from his wife and his 4 children. So these 2 Quaker women raised the money to buy his freedom from his slave master in Maryland. So he arrives in Lynn a fugitive, and he leaves a free man. He also arrived in Lynn. He was really unknown outside of a small circle of abolitionists. But when he left, and this is not me saying this, but David Blight from Yale is the leading Douglass historian in the country, and he said when Douglass left Lynn, he was the most famous black person in the world. And that was due to largely a book he wrote in Lynn. The book is really what puts Lynn on the map. And I've been to a lot of talks myself, and I always tell people, you leave and it's hard to remember anything, but remember one thing. Don't remember my book. Remember this book. Frederick Douglass wrote this book in Lynn in the winter of 1844-45, and it's called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. And the most important words in the title are the next 3 words. It says, written by himself. There were dozens of slave narratives at that point, but they would always be told to a white person would write it. Douglass, who has no formal education, was denied an education, beaten if he tried to get an education, was self-taught. And he was, I hate to use the word genius, I know in New England we only use that word for Bill Belichick, except for this season. I think we're dropping it. But Douglass had one of those memories. He could just speak to a crowd, and he remembered Shakespeare, and he quoted poets, and he was just an amazing person. But that book he wrote is such a masterpiece in the sense it's written by a slave. I'll get into the book later, details about it, but the book is so incredible. One of the greatest pieces of American nonfiction. The Library of Congress put that book, and that little book he wrote in Central Square in Lynn, in a little house he lived in by the railroad tracks. In those days, the railroad, if you know Lynn, the railroad ran along the ground. He was in that house with his wife and 4 little children, all under the age of 6. Trains going by, and he wrote this book. And the Library of Congress put it on a list they keep of books that shaped America. And also on that list are books like Moby Dick and Walden, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Frederick Douglass's narrative. So I'm going to, with my buddy Ron's assistance, which is like, I'm not going to yell Bob. That was, it's a name that another speaker used over and over. But I will just, and I'm going to go through these slides quickly because I could go on all evening, and I like to try to stop before people are actually throwing things at me. So some slides I'll skip because we just don't have the time to do all of this. We're going to go through this, and I want to give you a little idea of his life and then put Lynn in context so you get some extent. A lot of you probably know a lot about Douglass already, but so we'll do this briefly. This is he was a slave on the eastern shore of Maryland, Talbot County is where he was born, 1818. and he was on the Y plantation, W-Y-E, and the property was owned by Colonel Edward Lloyd, and Colonel Lloyd was arguably the most prominent man in all of Maryland. He'd been the governor 3 times, he'd been a U.S. senator, and he owned 10,000 acres and hundreds of slaves, including Frederick Douglass. Douglass's mother, her name was Harriet Bailey. She was a slave, and not long after he was born, they shipped her to another plantation, which they often do. They often broke up slave families, and she, rather incredibly, sometimes after finishing her day's work, would walk in the night to be with her little boy and climb into bed with him in the night and leave in the morning before the sun came up to walk back to her plantation to start her day's work. And Douglass wrote of her in his narrative, sort of hauntingly, he said, I can't recall ever seeing my mother in the light of day, which is tells you all you have to know about slavery. I can't recall ever seeing my mother in the light of day. And when she died, he said it was like hearing about a stranger's death. His father was a white man. They believe it was his slave master, Aaron Anthony. No one ever knows. I don't know why they've never done a DNA study, but to this day, no one knows. He was haunted Douglass to the rest of his life. When he was an old man, he was writing people from slave masters' children, anybody who could tell him. No one could tell him actually who his father was. So he escapes from slavery. And later, at the end of this, the 2 areas, I want to ask questions. I'm just going to go with the years as a slave and his relationship with Abraham Lincoln. There's just almost too much to say about those 2, so I'm just going to power through them. And if anybody does have questions at the end, I'll try to tell them. Particularly his relationship with Lincoln, I think, was fascinating. But
Tom, could you turn the microphone towards your mouth?
turn it toward me.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, that's better.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
When I look at you,
That way.
we'll go right by him. This is just Colonel Edward Lloyd. That's about as much time as I'm going to give him. I told you he was a 3-time governor. He gets his comeuppance in Douglass's narrative, and we'll get to that. So Douglass gets on a train in Baltimore when he's 20 years old. He makes his way to New York City, and he's taken in by this man, who's one of those men in history that's been forgotten. But he was a very important man. His name was David Ruggles. He actually had some stores. He was a newspaper editor, but he was head of the Vigilance Committee in New York City and helped an estimated 600 slaves escape through New York City. And he was, when Douglass got there, he was going blind, and within a year he was blind. And he was an incredibly courageous man. And Douglass lived in his apartment, which was in Lower Manhattan, where Tribeca is today, and he sent word back to Baltimore to a free black woman named Anna Murray, and she had actually helped him escape. She helped obtain a sailor's outfit and sailor's papers, and he jumped on a train with that disguise. So Anna Murray came up and got married in David Ruggles' apartment, and Ruggles said to him, we have to hide you better. We're going to change your name to Johnson. You know, he was born Frederick Bailey. That's really his name, Frederick Bailey. When he escaped, the papers he was carrying, I think, said Stanley, so he's Frederick Stanley. He changed him to Frederick Johnson. He goes to New Bedford, and the leader of the large black community there was Nathan Johnson. So when he sits down at Nathan Johnson's house, Nathan Johnson says, we got too many Johnsons here already. So what he says, I'm reading, this story's been told a million times, he was reading Lady of the Lake, which is a long narrative poem by Sir Walter Scott, and there's a character named Douglass in it, so he said, let's make you Douglass. So Frederick Douglass decided to put some flair, he'd add an S to it, so if you look at his name, he's got 2 S's. The only reason was he just wanted to make it a little bit special. Here's Anna Murray. There were Anna Murray Douglass, very few photos of Anna. And in the little book I wrote, I tried to do a chapter on her because I felt the more you think about her, I just felt so bad about her. You know, she was a incredible woman. She worked so hard. She lived really a parallel life with Frederick Douglass. He was not only self-educated but became learned, and she was illiterate. And in fact, I have a real estate document she signed with an X. That's all she could do, was sign things with an X. She was virtually a single mother. He was away so much that she pretty much raised her children on her own. I mean, he was a good father in many ways, but Anna was the one who was there all the time. And her daughter, after Anna died, her daughter made a presentation to a women's group in Washington, and she said, "Father was mother's honored guest." You know, and that's a heck of a thing to say about your dad. But she was a tremendously hard worker. When she was in Lynn, she took in shoe binding material at night, and she worked on that. In addition to, she had very little money, and he's away, but she always worked. She was a really hard worker. And I saw a letter from friends in Rochester, New York, a woman who was in the neighborhood, and she said, "When you saw the Douglass children, they were always well dressed and always well behaved." And I give Anna the credit for that. And she also went through a very difficult period with her husband. He had a white woman came over from England to help him run his newspaper in Rochester, and she lived in the house for several years. And she'd walk down the street arm in arm with Frederick Douglass, and rumors spread. Later in life, a black intellectual magazine writer came over from Germany, and I don't mean black, but she was a German woman who came over and wrote for a magazine. She came, and she stayed with them for 3 months, 10 or more summers in a row. And she actually fell in love with Douglass. She hated Anna, and Anna just put up with so much from this husband and his life. And there were times I've seen stories where famous people knock on the door, and she would answer the door with a bandana, and they'd think she was the staff and sort of brush by to go see the famous man. So I just spend this much time on her because she deserves some recognition. She was, I think, an amazing person. So William Lloyd Garrison, when I say he spoke in Nantucket and was discovered, it's Garrison. Garrison's the country's leading abolitionist. I don't know how many of you know his name. He was the driving force behind the New England Anti-Slavery Society, the Massachusetts, the American Anti-Slavery Society. He's best known as the editor of The Liberator, which was the great anti-slavery weekly that was published in Boston for 30 years or more. And he was really Douglass's hero. Douglass read The Liberator when he was young. He loved when he met Garrison. Garrison really was a major influence on his life. Later in life, when Douglass gets to Rochester, Garrison, they have a tremendous break, and really hate each other. They won't speak to each other. And in their papers, they write vicious things about each other. It's just heartbreaking to see, but it happened. So, but Garrison was a famous man. This is John Brown. I'm going to mention him quickly. A lot of you might know John Brown from history. He led that famous or infamous attack on Harper's Ferry. He tried to attack the federal arsenal there in Harper's Ferry in October of 1859. He's trying to get all the weapons out, run up into the hills, get the slaves to leave their plantations, lead a slave revolt, and that didn't work. He was captured, actually by Robert E. Lee but he was ended up being eventually hanged. And when he was hanged, he was such a mythic figure in the North that in towns around here, I know in Lynn, all the church bells rang, and there might have been a church here that rang bells for John Brown, but he became very close to Frederick Douglass. Douglass stayed at his house in Rochester. Brown stayed at Douglass's house in Rochester. Brown wrote his Constitution for this new state he was going to create at Douglass's house, so they became very close, and he tried to get Douglass to join his plot, but Douglass was wise enough to say no. So next slide. That face looks familiar, I just can't put a name to it. As I said, I'll do Abraham Lincoln at the end if there are questions, but Douglass spent most of his time attacking Abraham Lincoln in his paper. And they were, Lincoln's eyes were on keeping the country together. That was what he wanted to do. And Douglass was looking for a lot of change. And in Lincoln's first inaugural address, I apologize, I have a cold. His first inaugural address, he says, you can keep slavery in the South. And if your slaves escape, we'll enforce the fugitive slave law. We'll send them back. He just didn't want slavery to expand, but Douglass attacked him and attacked him and attacked him. They eventually become very close friends. And in Lincoln's greatest hour of need, just about in the Civil War, he calls on Douglass to try to save emancipation. So that's a long story in itself, and if we have time at the end, I'll get into it. But they became really close. So this is Frederick Douglass. Two of his boys, Lewis is on the left and Charles is on the right. This is Douglass became, in January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And after that, and Douglass had been pushing for this for several years to get blacks to fight in the war. He used to tell Lincoln and others, you're fighting this war with one arm behind your back, one strong black arm behind your back. And so early in 1863, they start recruiting black soldiers and sailors, and by the end of the war, 200,000 blacks had fought in that war. Douglass became a recruiter for the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Have you ever seen the movie Glory? That's on that regiment. They led that incredible assault on Fort Wagner, which was on an island outside of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. His son Lewis on the left was in that assault and got badly wounded, and I think it's the reason he couldn't really have children the rest of his life. But he did recover. And Douglass, through his sons, learned that even though the promises he'd made, that he'd been told that they would get equal pay and that they'd get commissions just like white soldiers, weren't true. And he also learned that when black soldiers were being caught and captured, they weren't going to a jail. They were either being sent back to slavery or being executed. So that was his first meeting with Lincoln. He went to the White House in August of 1863. And in those days, what's amazing about the White House, you could go there, and anybody could go. You could sit in the stairs or in a waiting room, and eventually you'd go in, and if there was time, you could meet the president and tell him whatever you wanted to tell him. People knew Douglass at that point a little bit, so he was escorted in. But when he went into Lincoln's office, Lincoln is lounged in a big chair, and Douglass starts to introduce himself, and Lincoln gets up and says, "I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. I think you've been reading about him and hearing about him." And Douglass is a man who gave not hundreds, but thousands and thousands and thousands of speeches, probably heard by millions of people. So his voice was so powerful. The word got back to Lincoln, but and Lincoln did not change things because of what Douglass said. But Douglass left there, even though Lincoln didn't agree with him on pay and commissions. He left there saying, really liking Lincoln. He said, "It's a rare occasion when I'm treated as an equal," and he said, "I felt that way with Abraham Lincoln." So I won't spend time. This is one of those women. This is Otil Assing, the German writer who came over, who fell in love with Douglass and hated him, and lived with them for 3 months every year for quite a while. She finally, it's a long story, she finally realizes she's not going to marry her. She goes back to Europe. She discovers she has breast cancer. She also hears that Douglass has married a white woman for his second wife. She's in Paris. She walks into the Bois de Boulogne. She sits on a bench. She takes cyanide and kills herself. And in her will, she left money to Douglass and she left books to Douglass. So this is Cedar Hill, Douglass's home in Washington, D.C. It's now the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. When he gets to Washington, one of the reasons he went there is because his house in Rochester was burned down. They were sure it was arson. At the time, he was writing story after story attacking the KKK, and he's sure that that's why his house was burned down. But he gets to Washington, and he became the driving force behind the let's say one of the driving forces behind the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment provided citizenship for anybody naturalized or born in this country, and also equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gave blacks the vote. And after the passage of the 15th Amendment, there was a huge rally in Baltimore. Tens of thousands of blacks marched and held a huge event, and they passed a resolution honoring Frederick Douglass as the foremost man of color in the times in which we live. So he was highly respected. Douglass became, Lincoln is the first Republican president. John Fremont ran before that, 1856, was not elected, and Lincoln, it's not even clear if Douglass ever supported Lincoln. He was very reluctant, even in 1864. He was always battling him, but he became a campaigner. Douglass did for Republicans, for Grant and Hayes and other ones, and he was a paid campaigner at some points. He'd go out. Douglass could give you the black vote. Blacks could vote, and Douglass could provide you that vote. So he was incredibly important to these people, and they started rewarding him. Grant named him to a commission that went to Santo Domingo, which was important in those days because the Navy was looking for a coaling station there for their ships. He also became United States Marshal for the District of Columbia. That was the first position held by a black person that required United States Senate approval. He became Register of Deeds for Washington, D.C. He became ambassador to Haiti. He held all these, allowed him to speak less because now he's getting a salary and is a very prominent person in Washington, D.C. He was able to, actually, a loan from a friend helped, but to buy this house, Cedar Hill. It had 21 rooms, 15 acres, fruit trees and gardens. And Anna was the gardener. Anna had gorgeous gardens everywhere she lived. They were just spectacular. And but from that house, he could see the United States Capitol. It's in the Anacostia region of D.C. And I always think about, when he was a slave boy, he would live in his slave master's house, and he slept in a closet on a dirt floor of a closet just off the kitchen. And in winter, when it was cold, he would climb inside a burlap feed bag. And he went from that to, it's not a mansion, but living in 21-room Cedar Hill. And it's a hell of a life story. So I'll be quick here. He married, after Anna died in 1882, he married a white woman named Helen Pitts, who was a secretary or a clerk in the recorder's office when he was recorder of deeds. She'd gone to Mount Holyoke. She was a suffragist. She was an abolitionist. She was very bright, and she was really a really good wife for Frederick Douglass. They traveled the world together when he was quite old. But her family cut her off entirely. His children wouldn't speak to him for a while. He never told them. He never told anyone. They just went to a minister's house in D.C., and a black minister, and got married. And the next day the papers had it, and it was a big scandal. Frederick Douglass, the crusader for black Americans, marries a white woman. He would always say, my mother was black, my father was white. I'm just covering the bases here, so. This is a man named John Hutchinson. He's from Lynn. When Douglass died, it was a big event. The United States Senate adjourned in his honor. There was a huge funeral at Metropolitan AME, a black church in D.C. Thousands lined up to view the body. Huge throng came to the funeral. The street was packed with thousands of people. And his wife, Helen Pitts, knew that years ago when he was young, for years and years, he had campaigned with the Hutchinson family singers. And they have a Lynn connection. They're actually from Milford, New Hampshire, but the Hutchinsons were the most popular singing group before the Civil War. And several family members continued singing for years. Either suffragists like Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton or abolitionists ran events. the first thing you did was sign up the Hutchinsons because you got a crowd. If you knew they were coming, think of the most popular sing. They're not quite the Beatles, but if you sign the Hutchinsons up. So every time Douglas was on a platform, almost the Hutchinsons were there as well, and he became very good, very close friends of theirs. And they were different. You know, the Boston abolitionists who were around Douglass were a lot of them were wealthy and intellectual, and also a lot of them didn't really treat Douglass as an equal. A lot of them looked down on Douglass. They wouldn't, for example, one admitted he was horrified at the idea of being seen walking down the street with Douglass. And here they are, these are our leading abolitionists, and they, or staying with them on the road. The Hutchinsons, you can see through their diary and things, they go somewhere, they say, Fred, come on, they share a bed with him. They're in a restaurant, every white customer leaves, all the staff leaves, the Hutchinsons don't leave. Frederick Douglass was their friend. So he really loved them. And so she sends the word, John Hutchinson comes all the way from Lynn, and he spoke and he sang at Douglass's wedding. So. I show this picture only, we'll just quickly go through slides. You know, I try to tell people that when Douglass came to Lynn, he's 23 years old. We always see this Frederick Douglass. He was a young man, and he's always described as very light-skinned. One of the abolitionists said he was 2 shades darker than Daniel Webster. You know, it was just, we don't picture Douglass the way he was when he was in Lynn. Several more slides, if you just flip through them. They give you a little bit, we don't have a picture of him at 23, these are closer to 30. But it gives you a little better idea. This is actually like 35, but what he might have looked like when he was, the next one, it's actually the one I used for the cover of the book I did because it was so startling. There was an exhibit at the African American Museum in Boston. It's based on a book. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man American of the 19th century, the most photographed American of the 19th century, more than Lincoln and Grant and Twain and everyone. And he did that intentionally. He would go for these professional sittings, and he would dress well, and he always looked sternly into the camera because magazines and newspapers are full of horrible racist caricatures of black people. And Douglass was on a crusade to say, this is what we look like. And so he ended up with, I don't know, so many photographs, but it is remarkable that he's the most photographed man of the century. This is James Needham Buffum. I don't know who here is from Lynn. He was a 2-time mayor of Lynn, a very prominent Lynn citizen. When Douglass knew him, he was a builder. He built 400 buildings in Lynn, homes and other buildings. He developed major sections of the city. He was also vice president of the Massachusetts Abolition Society. When I used to write for the Lynn paper, I would write sometimes a few stories about Douglass. There was a man in Lynn named Abner Darby who was head of the Community Minority Cultural Center. He'd always call me up and say, you keep writing about Douglass, but you never tell us why he came to Lynn. You know, and Abner has died, but if he were here, I'd say, you know, I still can't tell you. I just have to guess. Buffum was at this Nantucket meeting, and he controlled lots of buildings. He was a very prominent Lynn guy, and I think it was Buffum that's the reason they sent him to Lynn. I think he lived with Buffum for a while. Later, you'll see he buys a house from Buffum. When he flees Lynn and goes to Great Britain, Buffum goes with him. So Buffum was like a guardian angel of sorts, or they were close friends, even though they had falling outs, but they were very close friends. When every other abolitionist fell away from Douglass, when a controversy arose in the 50s, he stuck with him. So, anyways, that's James Needham Buffum. But this, as you can read, says the first train station. I said when Frederick Douglass came to Lynn, he was unknown, and he was. But within 3 weeks, he's all over the newspaper because he, on September 28, 1841, I apologize for these dates, but I can't get them out of my head. He boards a train in Lynn, Central Square, the Lynn Depot, with Buffum and with a man named John A. Collins, who was the head agent for the State Society. And Buffum and Douglass was really on a 3-month trial. not because they wanted it, but he wanted a trial because he didn't know what the heck this job was about. And Collins traveled everywhere with him, and a woman got on the train as well. So four of them are sitting there, and a conductor comes along, and he gets to Douglas, and he says, you know you can't sit here. And he actually had a confrontation with Douglas 3 weeks earlier in Newburyport. They were taking a train to New Hampshire, and the conductor, in that case, Douglas wouldn't move, so he had railroad workers drag him out of the car and throw him into what they call the Jim Crow car, the Negro car, the filthy car, the car with broken windows. And so the same thing happened September 28th in Lynn. Douglas won't move. Douglas says, I'll move if you give me one good reason. And the conductor, all he can say is, because you're black. And Douglas said, that's not good enough. So again, he calls for all these railroad workers, and Douglas and Collins are sitting together on a wooden bench, and they reach down and they just hold on to their seats. And these men come on and start pummeling them around the head, beating them, and they finally cannot get them, they can't get them off these seats. You've got to realize Frederick Douglass has been working with his hands his whole life. He's like a linebacker in football. He's a very powerful guy. What they eventually do is they pull the whole bench seat up, snap the bolts off the floor, and carry that whole bench seat down the aisle and throw it out onto this platform. Douglas really wasn't hurt too badly because Buffum walked off the train, and he and Douglas walked across Central Square to a stable, rented 2 horses. As Buffum wrote years later, 2 horses without any prejudice. And they rode those horses to the meeting in Newburyport. That became such an incident in Lynn. There were enough, even though Lynn was predominantly, when Douglas moved there, there were 44 free blacks living in a city of about 10,000. So it was he'd gone from New Bedford with a tremendous black population to an all-white Lynn. But there was a large Quaker community, and there was a large abolitionist community. They held protest meetings when this happened. There was I don't think I brought it with me, but I did bring it. I think it's the next slide. It even made the news. The next day it made the newspaper. You can read it. Another outrage on the Eastern Railroad against liberty and equal rights was perpetrated near the Lynn Depot yesterday morning. A well-looking, well-behaved young man, slightly colored, by the name of Douglas, with one S, that no one told him about the second S, took a seat in the first train of cars for Newburyport with John A. Collins when several rough men, if not ruffians, and the employee of the company collected together and, seizing hold of Douglas, dragged him out by brute force. The blame is much of it laid to Chase, the superintendent, who, it is said, directs not only this kind of violence, but threatens to refuse a seat to all who are in favor of admitting colored men to their natural rights. It became such a to-do that the train, and I thought it was interesting. Here I'm going through the papers, and I'm saying, oh my God, he's been here 3 weeks, he's in the news, so people know him. The train didn't stop in Lynn for a day or more, but there were a lot of prominent Lynn businessmen. They finally said, you got to stop here. They were afraid of demonstrations. It took, and a petition went to the legislature, but you'll be shocked to hear this. The legislature did nothing. It sounds like most of our legislature. And a couple years later, the board of directors, there were 3 railroads in Lynn that had Jim Crow, railroads in Massachusetts with Jim Crow cars, and they eventually, just under pressure, public pressure, they dropped the Jim Crow policy. But when I was looking at all of this, I come across a small item that they make such a big deal about Douglas, but at almost the same time, a woman named Mary Green gets on the train, and she's a black woman carrying her baby. She refused to move, and they physically threw her and holding this baby off this train. And you just think of the horrible stories, and she is forgotten. Nobody will ever remember Mary Green, but whenever I talk, I try to mention her name. I don't know. I just feel I have to. So I'm going to skip this. This is the historians care about this. He's the most famous orator of the century, black or white. His first recorded speech is in Lynn. So someone happened to be there from Pennsylvania. Here's a slave is speaking, so he can't believe it. So he goes and he writes down as fast as he can, and a Philadelphia paper printed it. I'm not going to go into it, but historians love to look at it and analyze it, because what was the greatest orator of the century saying when he first started? What was he saying in his first speeches compared to his last speeches? So we can go through it. I know anybody here is from Lynn, but this is Lydia Pinkham. Did you ever hear of Lydia Pinkham?
Yes.
She created this business empire by creating some sort of vegetable compound that cured women's ills. I don't know what women's ills are. I don't want to know. I've got a delicate constitution. But I really don't care about Lydia Pinkham. When she was young, her name is Lydia Estes, E-S-T-E-S. There's an Estes Road, in fact, in Lynn, where her family lived. She was the daughter of Rebecca Estes, who was this radical abolitionist. And the women abolitionists, members, the Women Anti-Slavery Society in Lynn was incredible, much more incredible than the men. I could tell their stories, but so she's Lydia Estes, the daughter of Rebecca Estes, and she hears about a lyceum in Lynn refusing to allow a black man to speak. So she's going to form her own, with some others, form her own lyceum or speaking society. And she's 20 years old, and she does that, and they form it, and then she makes her friend, Frederick Douglass, president pro tem of this little society. And I went to, when I was researching something, I went to the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and I found a letter between Lydia Pinkham and Frederick Douglass. They were great friends and remain really good friends. And but even more important than Lydia, she had a sister named Gulielma. That's sort of a Quaker name. If you look, William Penn, his wife was Gulielma. And Gulielma Estes had the audacity to walk down a Lynn Street arm in arm with Frederick Douglass. And she was dragged before her Methodist church to be expelled. And a man who knew her talked to her, and he knew the minister, and he talked to the minister. And then he wrote a piece in the Liberator, that Garrison's paper, where he recreated the dialogue between Gulielma when she's facing inquisition from the minister, and I'll read it to you. So the Methodist minister says to her, this is from did you take his arm? I think I did. How far did you walk? As far as Isaiah Chase's opposite Friends Meeting House. Now, if you know Lynn, 1A goes through Lynn. One of the streets in downtown Lynn is Silsby. They had a Friends Meeting House, a Friends School, and also a Quaker cemetery. All that's left today is behind a building. You can see little remnants of the Quaker cemetery. Did you ever walk with any other colored men? Yes, Charles Lennox Remond. Now, if you know from Salem, that's a very famous family there. He was the most prominent black abolitionist before Douglass. And are you much acquainted with colored people? And she replied, not so much as I hope to be. I always think of their mother would have been so proud of her. Asked if she would marry a colored man, she replied, color would make no difference. I see only character. So it took a lot of guts. You're talking early 1840s. This is, as I said, Frederick Douglass is spending all his time in Lynn traveling around speaking. He goes places dressed, well-dressed. He's quoting from Shakespeare. He's quoting from his favorite poet, the Scottish poet Robert Burns. He's quoting from the Bible. I've seen letters he wrote where he just starts quoting. He's way over in England. He says, don't book in front of him. His mind was incredible. But after a while, people started saying, you hear from the crowd, people saying, you couldn't have been a slave. There's no way you were a slave. No slave looks like this, talks like this. So Douglass finally decided, I got to prove who I am. So he comes home, winter of 1844 and 45, and he does an incredibly courageous act. He writes his life story up to that point. He had black friends who were telling him, why are you going around speaking? Why are you telling your story on platform? You've escaped, you're free. Just don't do it. But when they heard about this book, they said, you're out of your mind. You're going to tell them who you are. But that's what he did. In the book, he said, I'm not Frederick Douglass, I'm Frederick Bailey. And I'm from Colonel Lloyd's plantation, the Wide Plantation. My mother was Harriet Bailey. And the most impressive thing he did was, he was like a prosecutor putting out a criminal indictment. He says, Colonel Lloyd, this great man would go out to his stables where he had all these fancy horses. And if anything was wrong, old Barney, a black man, ran the stables. He would beat him with a whip till he fell to his knees. So here's the governor of the state beating an elderly man who's trying to run the stables. He listed overseers by name. They're the ones in direct control of the slaves. Not only beat slaves, but murdered slaves. He tells a story of driving a slave into a creek and blowing his brains out. He listed a woman who lived in that area, gives her name, and talks about her beating her slave across the face with an oak stick until she dies. He has a list of ministers, prominent ministers who run all the local churches, and one in particular who would strip his female slaves down to the waist and just beat their back till it's raw and bleeding. I mean, it's an incredible book. Wendell Phillips, another prominent abolitionist, said to him, "If I were you, I'd throw it in the fire." But Douglass wouldn't do it. He printed it. And when he printed it, he knew, and everyone told him, "You've got to flee." And that's when he left Lynn. August 1845, he goes to Great Britain. And Great Britain is where many abolitionists toured and spoke. I think we can jump to the next slide. So he goes there. Lyceum Hall on Market Street. They had a farewell dinner for Douglass there. I know Mr. Lowen could give a lecture on this subject that I cannot, but this is Daniel O'Connell, one of the greatest Irish heroes of all time. When Daniel O'Connell would speak, huge crowds would show up at his funeral. I think they said hundreds of thousands came. He'd fought for Catholic emancipation and independence. He was an incredible man, an abolitionist, and one of the great orators. Douglass goes to Ireland. He goes to England, but then his first real stop is Ireland. He says, "I can't believe it. I'm treated like an equal. I can eat anywhere I want. I can get on any conveyance I want." And then he sees a sign. It says, "Daniel O'Connell is speaking here tonight." Well, as a little boy, to help himself read, he got a hold of a book called The Columbian Orator. And it had all these speeches in it. And several speeches are by Daniel O'Connell. And he read them over and over, and I'm sure he memorized them. So he gets to Dublin. And who do we see is speaking? Daniel O'Connell is speaking. So Douglass has to get in. But the place is packed. You literally cannot get in. It's hard to explain today what a public figure Daniel O'Connell was. But finally the crowd, people start leaving. So he and Buffum weave their way to the front. Buffum finds O'Connell's son and says, "Would you tell him Frederick Douglass is here?" And they knew about Douglass. The abolitionists did because of Douglass' book and just his reputation. So word comes to O'Connell, and he calls Douglass up on stage. And with Douglass standing next to him to this huge crowd, he said, "I'd like to introduce the Black O'Connell of the United States." And Douglass loved that. He told that story over and over, the Black O'Connell of the United States. And within a year or so, Daniel O'Connell was dead. Also in Ireland, I know a lot of people here know their Irish history. He arrives in 1845. He's there till 1847. So that's the height of the Great Famine. And Douglass went out to the countryside. He saw people living in huts. He saw them living on the side of hills. He'd see their mouths green from eating grass. He saw them living in filth. It's hard to imagine. And here's what was amazing. I'll read a letter he wrote home about what he saw, the beggars in Dublin. But I always say to myself, he was a slave. He spent a year with a slave breaker that broke him and beat him so badly that his whole back is scarred. He saw horrible things. When he went to Ireland, he was horrified by what he saw. And if he was horrified, try to imagine how horrible it was. So he wrote this letter home to Garrison. And as brutal as this letter is, listen to how it's written by a man who has no education. "I had heard much of the misery and wretchedness of the Irish people previous to leaving the United States, and was prepared to witness much on my arrival in Ireland. But I must confess my experience has convinced me that the half has not been told. I spent nearly 6 weeks in Dublin, and the scenes I witnessed were such as to make me blush and hang my head to think myself a man. I speak truly when I say I dreaded to go out of the house. The streets were almost literally alive with beggars, displaying the greatest wretchedness, some of them mere stumps of men, without feet, without legs, without hands, without arms, and others still more horribly deformed, with crooked limbs down upon their hands and knees, their feet lapped around each other and laid upon their backs, pressing their way through the muddy streets and merciless crowd. As horrible as that is, it's so beautifully written, but it is just, I love this moment of Frederick Douglass writing about Ireland. So, also, this, after Ireland is when he goes to England, and those women, the Quaker women, become his friends, and they raise the money, and they buy his freedom. They later raised money so he could buy a printing press to start his newspaper in Rochester. I'm not even sure what's next. Yeah, I'm not going to, this is a very important person's life, but it's too much in the weeds. We'll go on. Oh, yeah, this is my most embarrassing moment. I finished this little book on Douglass. I make one discovery in Frederick Douglass, and I've sent it to people like David Blight and other Douglass historians. It's the one thing that they don't know that they're interested in. He lives in 3 different houses in Lynn, but he comes home from Great Britain on April 20th, 1847. He's feted here and there. He goes to events. Everyone's honoring Douglass. The great Douglass has come home. 6 days after returning, he buys this house on Newhall Street, the house at the top. As you go in Lynn, as you go toward the water, it's up on a hill heading down to the ocean in a very nice neighborhood. I'm going through archival registry of deed records after I finish this book. I don't know why I'm doing it, because I've been through them 1,000 times, and I stumble upon him buying a house. And I wish I'd found out, because when he came home, he told people, and the English newspaper said he's going to live in Lynn and start a newspaper. Was he going to start the newspaper in Lynn? But he comes here, and he buys this house on Newhall Street, and he comes with this dream of starting his own paper. Oh, the other important thing about the house is, just for people like me, knowing when he bought this house allows us to say with more certainty that the narrative, you always want to know where was Moby Dick written, where was this done? The narrative, we can pinpoint that it was written on this little house by the railroad tracks. So he comes home, he wants to start his newspaper, he goes into Garrison and says, I'm going to start my own paper. And Garrison says, that's a horrible idea. You're more valuable to us. You're valuable as a speaker. I mean, Douglass was a prize. They had speakers. They even had free blacks. They didn't have a slave, a former slave who could speak. So to lose Douglass, it would have destroyed them. You know? So they say, and also they said, well, other black people have tried to start newspapers. They don't make it. So they talked Douglass out of this idea. He abandons it. But that summer, he's touring with Garrison, and he meets a man in Pittsburgh who's the editor of a black paper, and he tries to talk Douglass into, you're Frederick Douglass. Black, the 3 million slaves in this country need to hear your voice. Another man in Ohio backs a newspaper. They convince him to do it, but he doesn't want to do it around here anymore. He doesn't want to compete with the Liberator, so he goes to Rochester, New York, and starts his newspaper there. So and he hangs on to that house for several years and finally sells it. He bought the house, though. When I'm looking at the sale, I should have said, Frederick Douglass, and it says the house was $2,200. And I'm thinking, he didn't have $2,200. Then I see who sold him the house. It was James Needham Buffum sold him the house. So I have to conclude the house was a gift. But so anyhow, I think I'm done. But I think one thing I wanted to read. This is just. I mentioned this newspaper in Rochester, the North Star, which is very famous. Well, in that house on Newhall Street is where he planned that newspaper. He wrote the prospectus, and it was published in other quote-unquote colored papers. So Newhall Street's famous for that, too. That's where this was written, the prospectus for the North Star. I'm not going to do the last one. The last one is just the sign they hope to put up in Frederick Douglass Park explaining. One thing we pushed them on, they named it Frederick Douglass Park in downtown Lynn, but had no sign saying it was Douglass Park. We finally put a little monument up, and now the state's agreed to, the state owns the park, to put up an interpretive sign saying this is a draft of that sign before it goes up. It says pretty much what I've told you. Becoming Frederick Douglass, the Lynn Years from slavery to fame and freedom. And it goes on to, in the last paragraph, it says, across from this park, he wrote Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which is on the Library of Congress's list of books that shaped America. So we're hoping that people walking into the park, they'll at least learn something about why Lynn was really an important stop in his life. So I'm going to read one last thing and then I'll stop. And I know my wife's probably been signaling me to stop 20 minutes ago. But when David Blight's book came out in 2018, it's over 700 pages, but it's called Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. And it won the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, and it is the classic work on Douglass. The New Yorker magazine reviewed that, but really their review, if you know the New Yorker stories, they go on, and their review became really a story of Douglass. But it ended with this sentence. I'll read you their last sentence. So this is the New Yorker. In his legacy as prophetic radical and political pragmatist, in the almost unimaginable bravery of his early journey, in the resilience of his later career, in his achievements as a writer, activist, crusader, intellectual father, and man, the claim that Frederick Douglass was the greatest figure that America has ever produced seems hard to challenge. So I will let it go at that, and I thank you for your patience. The food is waiting. If there are any questions, I will try to
do the raffle first, and then we'll see if there's any
questions. Yep.
Okay. Let's do the raffle.
Yeah, please. Hold it in. It says Ace Folds.
Ace.